everybody. It's Rob Seaver, Executive Director with Leads Counsel. I'm excited today to bring you today's webinar. This one's really special because it brings us back to who we are as a council. We are about regulatory and compliance, and today we're going to be doing a tale of two risks, TCPA and ad fraud. And I'm really excited today to bring you to two panelists that we have. We have ad fraud, Anura.io's CEO and co-founder, Rich Kahn. And on the flip side, I have the global ambassador, whatever his title is today. He's in charge of sales and marketing over at DNC.com, Ryan Thurman. Guys, thank you guys for joining me. I'm going to real quickly go over the housekeeping and give a few Leads Counsel notes because I usually end up saying those at the very end, and I think people probably drop off before I get to it. So I want to start off today. First of all, in your GoToWebinar control panel, the panelists today have agreed to answer questions along the way. And in the control panel, there should be a questions button or a questions box. Please, if you have any questions, ask them. I will be reading them as we go, and I will be trying to answer those for you or ask the panelists those questions so that they can answer them. Also, for the council, if you didn't know, we have lowered our silver membership down from $2,000 a year to $500 a year, or just $42 a month. It's a no-brainer to join. You can head over to leadscounsel.org under the membership tab and sign up today. It's super easy, and there's no reason at all. I will say that with the 20% discount that you get to Leads Cons as you sign up for those, and Mike Ferree over at Lead Generation World has also offered us this month, for the month of June, any sign up that I get at any level gets 2 free passes to Lead Generation World in January. There is absolutely no reason not to sign up. So I want to bring it right back to something that I actually enjoy. I love this. This is something that is in my DNA. We talk about it every day, TCPA and ad fraud. I wore my special shirt. I scare because I care, because I really do care. And I'm going to kick this off at the very beginning with one of my favorite board members. He is a platinum member. He is a member of our board of directors, Rich Kahn, who started Anura.io and also eZanga, if you remember him from the day. Rich, thank you for joining me. Before we get into all of this, tell me a little bit about what Anura does and what you do at Anura.
Well, Anura is really, at the end of the day, is designed to identify if the visitor that's interacting with your web asset is real or fake. And by fake, we're looking at bots, malware, and the more elusive human fraud. And by understanding that information, it can solve a myriad of problems for people in different areas, from TCPA compliance risks to campaign performance to all kinds of stuff. And essentially, what I do at here is I was the chief developer of the software 15 years ago when we first put the software together. I still help from time to time inside of our what we call our geek pad, the people that are working on the fraud and the hacking that goes on there. I don't get to write code anymore, but I do get to go in there and talk shop, which is nice. Help with the marketing side, help with the sales side, and try to grow the company like everybody else does in their business.
That's cool. We're going to get deeper into that. Trust me, people. This is something where we're not just stopping at the intros. And I'm going to move this over to somebody that I've really grown to really like over the years. I've attended their conferences. I gotta admit, I steal from their content all the time. I take from it. They may know it, they may not know it, I don't know, but there's a lot of great stuff that they're doing in the space. Ryan Thurman over there at Contact Center Compliance, DNC.com. Help me understand what you guys do and what you do for the company.
So we are a cloud-based compliance company specializing in all things contact center and lead gen. We focus mainly these days on TCPA and helping people eradicate litigators, dealing with caller ID fraud, checking for caller ID reputation scores, helping people figure out what kind of leads they're getting, whether they're real, not real, in terms of the validity of phone numbers, making sure they don't have reassigned phone numbers in there, and also making sure that they can, most importantly, get their calls through or their texts through with all the scam likely and the call blocking issues that are coming around.
So that I don't mute. I will tell you that this is something that I can't wait to dig into because we talk TCPA every single day. So I can't wait to get back to that conversation. I'm going to kick it right back to the very beginning. We talked about this about a week ago when we did the practice run for this. And one of the things that caught me was that when I asked Rich, I said, help me understand ad fraud. Help me understand why it impacts lead gen, why it's so important to lead generators. What can we do? Those types of things we talked about last week. But the one thing that struck me was he said, look, we start at the top of the funnel and we're present all the way through, but it starts here. Rich, help me understand, when you told me that, what does that mean and why is it so important for lead generators?
Well, you got to understand, a lead starts when a visitor lands on a landing page, right? And there's many different layers as he goes down what I call the funnel before he becomes a validated lead ready to be sold or ready to be called. So at the very beginning is kind of where we start our process. We start our process at the beginning to identify, is this person that we're about to take down this funnel real? And that's the first and foremost. And from our standpoint, it's binary. It's either a real person or it's not. And just like in real life, either there's a real person behind that click or it's not. So for us to identify there, because before you take them down the funnel, and what I mean by that funnel is the stages that lead goes through before it becomes a validated lead. So you're going to check to make sure that the phone number is legitimate. It matches the name, it matches the email address, all that stuff matches. You want to make sure they're not a serial litigator. You want to check stuff through a company like DNC. There's all these different checks and balances before someone can turn around and say, I have a valid lead. Now I can sell it or I can call it whatever I'm going to do with it. So at that very top of the funnel, it's important to identify if it's real or not. Because I'll give you an example. Let's say you start off with a person who is a fraudulent human fraud farm. What they're going to do is they're going to land on a landing page, they're going to fill out the form, and they're going to fill out the form using information that's real. It's going to be a real person's information. The name is going to match the email address. It's going to match the phone number. Everything's going to look good, and they're going to pass that form on because typically they're getting paid somewhere in the marketing chain, whether it's from an impression, a click, for the lead generation itself. So now it goes down the funnel. It starts to pass all these checks, a fraudulent lead. And it'll pass all the checks. They'll check off the TCPA compliancy box because they're human. If you're recording the transactions, it looks real because, again, it's human that's interacting and filling out the form. And it goes all the way down the pipe. By the time it gets to the bottom, someone thinks, I've got a good lead. It passed all my checks. Then you pick up and call the person. The person on the other end of the phone says, I never filled out the form. And I have no business dealing with you guys. I'm not into whatever it is you're selling. And a lot of times people will just brush that off as, okay, maybe it was a fat finger mistake or something came along, but with all those checks, we know it's not. So at the end of the day, it was a fraudulent person filling out somebody else's information unbeknownst to them, which created this entire issue going down the funnel and all the other costs that go along with the checks. And at the end of the day, they're now breaking TCPA compliance. They wasted money and resources on generating that lead. They wasted call center resources. And they do this enough times, they end up having brand reputation issues. It all starts at the very top of the funnel.
You know, I was talking to, I think it was Matt Tillman at Rate Marketplace, and I was trying to understand, you know, what the difference is, and maybe it was somebody else, but I talk to people all the time about this. When you say ad fraud, when I said that to other people, they immediately said, well, that's not like form fill. That's not. And yet, when I read everything that you have or I listen to what you say, you always consistently continue to say ad fraud. Is a fraudulent form fill and submission, is that in your book still ad fraud?
It's a confusing market. So think of it this way. Where does that lead come from? It comes from advertising somewhere. You're advertising, whether it's an affiliate, programmatic, display, search, social, someplace along the line, even organic. You paid to generate or did something to generate that lead through advertising. So we consider that advertising fraud, but it can be considered lead fraud. It could be considered e-commerce fraud. There's a lot of other frauds that come into place. And you can't use the word fraud because there's things like identity theft and marriage fraud. And, you know, I know this because I advertise on the keyword fraud, and the phone was ringing off the hook with people having problems with their marriages and people having problems with everything under the sun fraud related, but it wasn't anything to do with what we do. So fraud, ad fraud is probably the best single term to use for the space, but it's not the only term. So it could be used a lot of other ways. But again, all those leads start from something, and it starts from advertising. So that's kind of why we relate it to advertising fraud.
I was just hopeful that when you said about marriage fraud, it wasn't about that. I love her dearly, so in general, I didn't know where you were going to take that. Ryan,
No.
It's good to know. Ryan, listen, I want to move now things back to the form fill. I want to talk about, okay, those opt-ins and when we start making phone calls and they get into where Rich has already touched a little bit how that fraudulent form fill could create a TCPA issue, and we're going to get back to that with Rich. But for you, TCPA has a much broader than just the outcomes of the court. I know at dnc.com, you guys track a lot of things and you've got some products and services that help that. How does the rubber meet the road when that form comes in and what people need to, or when that form fill comes in and what people need to understand to keep themselves compliant?
Well, the most common question that we get in the situation of the form that's filled out these days, typically everybody's asking for TCPA consent, right? They have the checkbox, they have the language, they think they're dialed in and they're protected, but we get opt-in leads. I see it all day on these Skype chat groups. I've got opt-in leads for sale. They're TCPA certified, Jernaya, active prospect, whoever they're using to certify that. But what they don't understand is a litigator will fill out that form all day long because they're going to go around and make the most common TCPA demand, which is, I never filled out that form. It wasn't me. I couldn't have done that. I was driving to the dentist at that time. So you have that going on where you have these litigators who will fill out the forms. They'll even not only fill out forms as leads, but they'll sign up for services, right? They'll act and feign interest. And it's pretty common. So unless you're tracking for that information and know who these people are, you can fall victim to that pretty quickly. And that's kind of where we come in on being able to identify these people. But the other issue that Rich brought up is you get somebody who isn't a real person. They fill out the form. It's a bot. It's one of these click farms. And you go to call that person who you thought gave you consent is basically able to sue you under the reassigned phone number rule or the wrong party contact, because they can just claim that they never filled out the form. So it opens up the whole issue of the reassigned wrong party contact, because all they got to say is, I never filled it out. Here's the proof that I was at the dentist at that time. So that consent is only as good as you can validate it at that time, that you can confirm that it was that person. Like Rich said, you also need to be able to make sure that person really owns that phone number and make sure that it's a real phone number. And that's what we're seeing a lot more companies from, not just the lead gen side, but even like more of the enterprise space, credit unions, banks. They want to make sure from a fraud perspective that the person that's actually giving you that phone number is who they say they are, because it's real easy to go scrape the web and find contact information of people and then throw it to the form. And in the ad space, these guys have already gotten paid on the back end as a sub-affiliate of whoever, and so they don't care. So you as a lead buyer, you've already paid for a lead that's not real. Now you got a TCPA violation on top of that, and somebody that's claiming that they didn't consent, and you called them or texted them, used an ATDS, and they want, $20,000 or they're going to file in federal court. One of my clients just sent me one of the letters they got, and it's like, they're all the same, but at the end of the day, nobody goes to court because they want to get rid of these things. So, you're paying for these fake leads, and then they're not who they say they are. So unless you're going through the funnel and putting these checks and balances in place, you're vulnerable to it, because a lot of the lead buyers, it's all, speed to lead, right? Who's going to call? Who's going to get a hold of these people first? So a lot of these folks that are litigators that'll fill out these forms or have somebody working for them doing the dirty work, they know that is going to happen. They know they're going to get 20 calls, 20 texts. And so that's the most common thing, going back to what I was saying earlier, is that people are like, well, why do I got to worry about all this TCPA? I get consent. It's like, well, you're going to get consent leads all day long. What you don't realize is that people have learned to fool the system, and they'll play all kinds of other games that I can talk about, and some of the tricks some of the attorneys have told us. And it's just amazing. But at the end of the day, they'll give you the consent, but how do you know it's the real person? How do you weed all
Yeah.
this stuff out in the funnel so that you're not, wasting your time trying to chase a ghost, basically? They're not going to buy anything anyway. So
Yeah, I don't want to jump around here, but what I can say is that there was a ruling just last week that came out of, I believe, the Ninth Circuit that basically slapped somebody because the person who filled out the form wasn't the person who owned the phone. And that could happen in a reassign situation. It also could happen in a fraudulent situation where somebody's intentionally putting the inaccurate information in. In fact, we know that with some of the serial litigators out there, that their intent is to defraud the system, and whether or not the court sides with the defendant or the plaintiff, it doesn't matter. In this case, you still have a case that you're going to have to defend and pay for. Tell me this, at dnc.com, do you guys have a product for this reassigned number, or do you know what somebody could do because I do know this, they could have the disclosure on the page, which is correct and written by the best attorneys in the world, court approved. They could have third-party lead verification, i.e. active prospect, Jornaya, trusted form lead ID. We've checked all the boxes, right? And yet we could fail TCPA because of that last thing that you just talked about. Is that correct? And therefore, what could we do as a person in the space?
Yeah, absolutely. We provide not only a reassign scrub, but the ability to do a combination between, is this person who they say they are? So like a right party check, but then also, has this phone number been reassigned since this interaction date? So the reassign stuff really hits people, especially on chasing not so much fresh leads, but stuff that's aged, 2 weeks, 3 weeks as you're following up, especially people are digging in the well, trying to make things work, kind of emerging out of COVID, going back on leads that they maybe gotten in March and April, where the phone number churn is real. I mean, you'll see 100, 200,000 numbers a day that roll over. And when you do a reassign scrub, even if you've been really tight with your data practices and doing all your verification, every time you talk to somebody, like they'll ask you, making sure your phone number is correct, you'll see 5, 10, 15% of data fall into this reassign bucket. So we do that now through the telcos to basically do that verification of the name, phone number, and last contact date. And then what's coming down the pike is the FCC has made this where it's going to be a nationalized database. They've realized this is a problem. There's not a single source. There's a gap in the ability to look up this information in the telcos. So they're getting the Verizon's, AT&T, T-Mobile of the world together to come up with this nationalized database. And so we're eventually going to have the best of both worlds to do a telco dip plus an FCC dip to do the verification and provide the safe harbor, because the only way you'll be able to get a safe harbor is by running the data up against their nationalized system, which basically is going to be where you provide the phone number and the date of last contact, and then the FCC will tell you if it's been reassigned or not. So that's good because we'll have another way to verify that information. The bad is, let's say the FCC comes back and say it doesn't give you enough information, but you've been able to verify that that lead and that phone number does belong to that person. Whose information do you trust? Do you throw away the data because the FCC said one thing, but you've been able to verify that that information is correct? So that's why I think it's important to have a couple different data points. And of course, the FCC is going to want they're going to want to charge people for this too. So now the cost is going to go up, right? Where right now, a lot of people balk at the cost of running a reassigned scrub because it adds cost to a situation where you have thin margins already. Now you got to run another process on top of that to identify reassigned phone numbers. So we've done some use cases where what we'll do is we'll run the reassign, but then we'll go run a skip trace on the back end of that to go find the phone numbers that are bad, to find a good phone number of the person, to justify the cost to detect the reassigned phone number, so that kind of pays for your detection on the front end, so that you can actually build some ROI out of it. Because that's the bigger problem we're finding right now, is that people have bad data, right? They have a bad phone number for their customer. It's old, because it used to be people kept their phone numbers for longer periods of time. I'm sure all of us on the phone, we probably have the same phone number from 15, 20 years ago. But Millennials, younger generation, people that are in credit collections, or people that are really just shopping. Sometimes they'll use a Google Voice number. It doesn't even belong to them because they simply just want to know what the best deal is I can get, and so they don't always give you the right information. So being able to figure that out ahead of time, going back to the other issue, which is it's all about performance, right? If you're wasting your time chasing ghosts, bad phone numbers, chasing leads that didn't belong to the people, or numbers where somebody else owns it, they weren't going to be interested in whatever offer you had to begin with. So that really can increase your performance by, kind of looking at the compliance side, which a lot of companies have a hard time digesting that cost or that added piece that they got to add in there. But if you look at it from a performance issue, when you're going to be talking to more people that are actually interested in weeding out the compliance, it can actually yield better results.
I'm going to get back to that because you said something that piqued my interest, and hopefully I'll remember that. My brain is getting 53 years old and sometimes is not able to come back to the starting point, but I wrote it down. Rich, look, you and I talk quite a bit about this, and I really feel ad fraud is one of our top, if not the top things today to consider. We've got buyers, we've got sellers, and we've got platforms out there. How bad is ad fraud in your eyes? What you're seeing through your platform? Like, I've heard you spit some numbers out that actually are pretty scary. And the second part of that question is, how well do you believe the industry either understands it, believes it, refuses to believe it, or in general, flat out just doesn't care? Kind of give me an assessment of what we're looking at there.
All right. So again, top of the funnel, brand new clients that we bring on average, we're finding around 25% of the visitors that are coming through are fraudulent. So with us, the way we sell our product is always based on an ROI factor, right? Because again, everyone's always worried about everybody's trying to take a slice of the pie, and the raised within margins already. So every time you add a new check or a new solution or a new filter, there's a process that has to happen, and there's a cost behind it. So when you look at it, 25% of the stuff coming in on average, and again, it all depends on where you're getting stuff. Like I said, if you're buying on the tier one side of things, tier one search and social, you're going to be on the lower end of that. If you're on affiliates and programmatic display, you're going to be on the higher end of that. So somewhere, basically, like I said, we're our average 25% coming in. So imagine if you were able to save 25% of your traffic acquisition costs, how that helps grow a company. And one thing, just talking about that, when you eliminate the fraud going down to a client, so they're not getting those people who said, I didn't fill out this form because it was a fraudulent lead that came through that we were able to stop, their ROI goes up. And when the ROI goes up, the client demand goes up. When client demand goes up, your company grows as a whole. So you're looking at 25% fraud from right at that standpoint. What we're seeing is prior to 2018, fraud was probably a couple billion, single-digit billions, anywhere from 4 to 7 billion. It would fluctuate. It wasn't actually growing or shrinking. It was just kind of humming along there. In 2018, it jumped to just around $20 billion in fraud. It was almost a 300% growth. And then last year was 42 billion estimated for last year. So fraud is on the rise because they're getting away with it. They're finding more and more advanced ways of sneaking past everybody, stealing your dollars or your client's dollars, and being able to take advantage of that. So the other answer to your question was, what do people think about it? And I'm on demos every day. So I'm talking to people about this on a regular basis. So if you have typically less than 5% fraud, you probably don't have clients complaining too much about it. It's 1 in 20 leads are coming through that are fraudulent. It's not like the end of the world, and it's kind of the cost of doing business, and they've kind of gotten used to it. They don't recognize that as a fraudulent issue, just, hey, maybe somebody entered the wrong information in when they filled out my form. Once they start getting beyond 5%, 5, 10%, all of a sudden clients start complaining, start charging back, and the higher you go up that scale, the more prevalent it becomes from a client complaint, where now people are trying to figure out, what is this? And we're always trying to find out how to connect with these people because they're out there and they don't know it's ad fraud. They don't know it's fraud. They just know there's a problem. They don't know how to address or how to search for it. I'll give you an example. We had a client come on, and they were in fear of losing their business because the complaints were coming in so quickly, and demand letters were coming in. It was a big mess. We put them on the system. It was 54% fraud. So 1 out of every 2 leads that they were selling were garbage, and we were able to help them get ahead of it very quickly and start reducing the fraud and start finding out where it's coming from and help to solve that problem. But the big thing was when we got them on the phone, they didn't know it was fraud. They found our company. They found some article we wrote on affiliate fraud, and they were hoping and praying that what they had was something that we can solve, because outside of us, they didn't know what to search for. So a lot of companies, they don't really know about it. They don't really know it's considered fraud, because it doesn't sound like, you said before, it doesn't sound like ad fraud. Even though it truly is a subset of ad fraud, they just know something's not right with the leads that they're selling. They don't know why. You see this also too. Sometimes you call somebody back and they'll say, hey, I just fill out the form because I just wanted the information, and they put the real information in. More times than not, though, they put in bogus information. So if you put out really, really good content, and it's something that we do on the space on a regular basis, you see the content all the time, we get people that are filling out the forms using bogus email addresses. And of course, inside of our CRM, it pops up that it just bounced. We know it's good information. We know it's the right person. They want the information. They just want to give up their information. So one thing that we consider doing is just adding in more fields, because the more fields you add, the less likely people are to fill it all out. But again, at the end of the day, if it's the real person, they want your information, and they don't want to be contacted, instead of not checking the box, yeah, I opt into being marketed to, they just put in bogus information. So that happens too. But yeah, most people don't realize it's a fraudulent issue.
So I understand that ignorance probably factors into quite a bit of ignorance, not being competency, but just a lack of understanding that it's going on. But I feel with maybe, and quite honestly, opinion here, folks, not fact, opinion. This probably is something that isn't just ignorance fueled within the space. There's an understanding it's going on. Do you feel that way? I mean, do you feel, just based on the companies that you work with, that there's a deeper understanding of what's going on here?
Yes and no. Some companies I talk to, they'll literally turn around and say, I know I've got a problem. I think it's fraud. Let's figure it out. And we run a free trial so we can literally find out if they have fraud, which, yes, is the answer. If they're driving in traffic, they have fraud. It just comes to what extent, right? I'll give another example. I was doing a demo for somebody, and their biggest problem was they felt people were putting in the wrong information. And I said, well, that happens. It doesn't happen often, but how often does this happen?
Intentionally or unintentionally?
They thought it was like the fat finger mistake kind of a speech, where someone is putting their phone number and they just constantly put the wrong phone number. And I said, well, how often does it happen? They're like, 15% of the time. That doesn't happen 15% of the time. Mark, when I talk to my clients who are using our solution, they still get that, but it's like 1% or less. It doesn't happen a lot. Especially a lot of these companies have these checks to make sure the name matches the email address, all that good stuff. But yeah, it's funny because when they looked at it, we loaded up our software. We saw it was about 15%, and it was fraud. It wasn't a fat finger mistake. It was mostly fraud. So those are the kinds of issues where they're not sure, and that's why we do the free trial. We want to be able to find out if there really is a problem there, because our job, like most of our companies, and DNC, same thing. We're here to solve a problem, and as a business make money doing that. But we want to basically, first and foremost for the client, is solve the problem that they're running into. And not every case I run into is a fraud problem. I mean, they have fraud and it solves a different problem for them, but we want to make sure the problem that they're having at that time is something that we can solve. But it's funny because sometimes you'll hear people, they're a little weary about running a trial to find out how much fraud they have, because once they realize it's actually fraud, they got to do something about it. So that becomes an issue, because again, if you're a publicly traded company and all of a sudden I uncover 25% fraud, what does that do to your business?
Yeah, we're going to get into that. I want to talk about that. Ryan, I want to go back to you, and I like this tennis match type thing between TCPA and ad fraud. It works well for me, keeps both sides of my brain working, or the one side that's still working. Here's what I want to ask you. On the ACA ruling that came out just a bit ago, there was a provision, a one-time provision, a safe harbor for that, call, reassigned call, and that was taken away in that ruling. And I thought, maybe I'm wrong, but I thought you said that there is another provision that's going to be put back in, or did I misunderstand you as they're trying to reestablish this reassigned database?
Yeah, they took away the one call get out of jail free card because it was just too arbitrary and hard to define whether it was a call or a call attempt and so right now there is no safe harbor for reassigned phone numbers. You make one call to somebody who you had prior consent, they signed all your T's and C's, they signed all your language your attorney signed off on, and that number got reassigned and you didn't do anything about it. They can come after you. You can't claim any kind of safe harbor. And that's really the bigger problem with TCPA is there's very limited safe harbor. And so the new safe harbor basically that they're proposing is we're going to nationalize the database. In order to get safe harbor for reassigned phone numbers, you have to take your data and send it into us or send it into a service provider like us who will eventually hopefully have access to that. But what's interesting about it is they're saying you have to take your phone number and your date of last contact, and we'll tell you if it's reassigned or not. So the problem I've run into is a lot of companies, their source of truth for what that last contact date is, they're not comfortable with it because they weren't really worried about tracking it so much. So either they don't have it or they don't trust it. And so unless you start capturing that information and making sure that you can know when that pivot point is, you're not going to be able to go run your data and get that safe harbor because you won't know what that date is. Just talked to a credit union the other day and they're like, well, we want to do all the reassigned stuff because for us right now, the date is optional to run a reassigned scrub. You don't have to have it, but it's better because it gives you back these mismatch information where we can say, hey, look, the name doesn't match because friends and family plan, business owned cell phone, but we haven't seen any reassigned activity. So okay to call, but still maybe a little bit of risk there. So if you're not capturing that information like these folks weren't, you can't get that extra category, which with the new reassigned database, it's coming. I mean, at some point, the carriers will finally stop fighting about it in the sandbox and we'll have a solution we can tap into. You're not going to be able to get this. You're not going to be able to get the safe harbor. So that's really especially if you listen to a lot of the TCPA attorneys that are out there, they'll tell you like, you better start making sure that you're capturing, storing, and knowing that last contact was validated, which is again, why as a consumer on our side, as normal human beings, you're seeing a lot of these companies, hey, is this your phone number? When you go talk to your healthcare plan, they're always asking you, is this your current information? Because they're all trying to think ahead that, we need to be able to use that going forward. So TCPA in general, the safe harbor really only exists for very limited circumstances. And that argument of, hey, we did everything right, we, had all our ducks in a row, it only works in certain circumstances. And that's really why you see all these professional plaintiffs preying on people and going after them, because there's not a lot of ways you can just claim safe harbor and walk away from it.
I have a question that came in from Robin Stone and says, could providing phone numbers and last contact date give regulatory groups ability to use this information to bring enforcement actions against the company giving the information for clearance? So basically, is this a bait, kind of an attack type tactic on the regulatory side?
Yeah, it could be. You've seen this on the side where companies are very interested with the problem with caller ID and call blocking and call labeling, where once you've determined that you have a problem, either by using us or another way to verify that you're getting scam likely on your phones or getting your calls blocked, the next step is resolution. How do I get these phone numbers delisted that I own so I can get my calls through and get hold of my leads? Well, what happens is you have to provide all your campaign information in order to kind of get your numbers whitelisted. You have to tell the carriers all about your campaign information, type of calls, cadence of calls, frequency. So all that information now you've released. Now you may have not even done anything wrong, but now you've released that information. So I could see the same thing with reassigned phone numbers. Now you're telling the FCC, hey, I made these calls, and now they've got information on that. And what we've seen at our company, or at least in looking at what's out there in the regulatory field, is it used to be, with TCPA, it was really the private party issue. Well, now the FCC is coming out with a lot more. They were pretty silent for a long time, but now they've got more ammo to come after people because guess what? They increased the fines. Now you're looking at almost 44 grand a pop for a DNC or a TCPA violation if the FTC or an FCC comes after you. So I would imagine that would be a concern because now you have to provide that information. So,
yeah.
But again, if you don't do it, you don't get the safe harbor. So you're kind of like,
we had heard that database was going to be ready last year. And do you have any indication on what we're looking at time-wise, or are we still further away than we are closer?
I heard maybe sometime later this year, but it's kind of like shaken and stir, which is the call authentication standard.
Yeah, we're going to get into that
it's
for
really,
sure. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really tough to tell. And I was looking before we got on the webinar to see when it's going to come out. I mean, they're still trying to get the whole process in place with the reassigned phone number database. They have to get an administrator in place. So a lot of people are speculating that the current numbering plan administrator is going to take that on. So they have to put those rules in place. And then with Shaken and Stir, they basically have to put in vetting of companies, right? So before you can get your calls authenticated, they want to make sure that what you say you're going to do on your calls is actually truthful and that you're not going to be saying that you're going to running, let's say, callbacks on mortgage leads, but in fact, you're doing call warranty scams on the back end. So there's still some moving parts in there, but the best place I've found to follow is just directly with the FCC. They've got some good timelines on there. And the thing that I will say is that with the reassigned phone numbers and with Stir Shaken, you want to go out and file your comments as a company because they are looking at those. And that's where I think a lot of companies may have missed the boat, is providing that input so that we don't end up with more regulations that aren't
For sure.
looking at how the industry actually operates.
Yeah. I have a question here that I'm going to have to read, and I butcher these things, but it's from a dear friend that asked me, and I'm trying to make sure that Rich, this question gets asked exactly like it's meant to be. The point that seems really difficult to fully solve is fraudster John Doe enters Rob Seaver, my phone number, my address, even potentially my email. I would imagine they know a little bit about me when they're entering this information, the fraudster. A lot of that information is publicly available. Then they call me and I'm the owner of the phone number, but I didn't enter it. Fraudster John Doe entered it. Is there, what's going on there, and what can we do about it? And is that something that can be identified or tracked? I'm just trying to understand, is it by IP address? What could we do here?
Okay, so what's happening, and that's exactly the type of fraud we see, is that you have a fraud farm from somewhere overseas, typically, that is taking real information that they're getting online and filling it out a form in order to get paid somewhere along the line, right? They're either getting paid on the impression, the click, they're getting paid on maybe filling out the form. So ultimately, at the end of the day, they are getting paid one way or another. So ultimately, what happens is this fraudster knows if I'm entering in somebody else's information and I came along, company A's division, and filled out the form with Rob's information, Rich's information, Ryan's information over and over again from the same IP, same computer, same device, what's going to ultimately happen is the person who's getting the forms are going to see this. It's obvious information, right? The same IP address, same everything's the same. Plus now, of course, if they use their real IP address and real device information, they let that go through, they're now traceable. So if somebody wanted to commit, if they were committing fraud, you can now trace them by IP. So what do? They have to play some type of networking hacks to spoof their IP address, make it look like it's coming from some other part of the world. They have to, if they're coming from the same machine, they want to spoof that device as many times as possible so it looks like it's coming from a variety of different devices. And when they start doing that, that's how we're able to detect them. So basically what we do is we collect hundreds of data points on their entire environment, everything from hardware, software, plugins, everything about their environment. And we're looking for spoofing, or we're looking for alterations or anomalies through that data chain. And if we can identify that, we can positively identify that as John Doe that, filled the form out using somebody else's information. That's how we understand that it's not the same. It's not the same person. Because let's face it, Rob's going to fill out the form. He's going to fill it from his laptop. He's not going to, hack the internet and spoof his IP address and do all this weirdness. He's going to physically sit down. He might jump on a VPN, which is fine. He might do a couple different things, but he's not doing the extent of what these fraudsters are doing to hide themselves and make it look like it's somebody they're not. And based on all that information, we can definitely tell them if they're real or not. Doing it manually, like I said, if you can't do it just by IP address, especially in this day and age, there's a lot of residential IPs. There's services out there that will rent you residential IP addresses, so you can bounce off of somebody's modem, typically a cable modem, and make it look like it's coming from Rob's house. And it's really not. So there's telltale signs of identifying that information to identify whether the IP address itself is compromised or the person behind it. Because remember, you have an IP address, and behind an IP address could be lots of different devices, right? So let's say my office, I have one IP address for the entire staff, but I have a lot of different devices, from laptops, iPads, phones, Alexas. All those things have their own IP address behind the main IP address. So a lot of different devices. And then behind each device could be multiple users. So for example, let's say you have a general computer for staff. When they walk in, they can just sign up. You don't know who's using it, but there could be a lot of different users logging into that machine with different user IDs and using that machine. Well, malware or botnets that run off that machine, maybe it's a compromised machine, are an individual user. So what we try to do is identify the user that's using that's in that connection stream at that time that they're filling out that form. So is it a malware that's taking advantage of a computer as a user? So again, that IP address may be bad at that particular point in time for the malware, but then Rob sits down at his computer, starts using the computer. He's a real user. We want to let that lead form get filled out because he's a real user. So it's not a simple thing as just an IP address. There are certain IP addresses out in the marketplace that are physically 100% doing nothing but fraud. It's a small list, the small list of a couple 100,000, I should say, small list. But there are a lot more fraud that takes place over compromised IPs, data centers, all kinds of interesting things that are harder to track just by the IP address alone.
Ryan, there was a question that came in. Is there a limit to the number of times? And I would suspect that the question, because it didn't ask, but I would suspect it's under TCPA. Is there a limit that a lead gen company or a call center under TCPA can call that lead? Number of times?
It really isn't. Yeah, I mean, I'm not an attorney, so I can't really quote case law, but as far as I know, there's not really a limit. There's kind of best practices, right? Like I'm sure Leeds Counsel kind of has some best practices. There are limits when it comes to credit and collections calls under FDCPA, under those kind of rules. But usually, I mean, I've been asked this before, it's usually within reason, right? The more times you call somebody and hammer them, the more likely that you may cause them to want to take action, right? If they're not happy with your offer, or if they, a lot of times, it's that first couple of companies they talk to, they solve their problem, and then everybody else after that now is just going to pile on. So they may want to aggravate them. Years ago, I heard a serial litigator speak in front, I think it was at a PACE conference. Sergey Lemberg, he's the one that invented the app that has made like $30 million. And somebody asked him, what drives you to want to take a case? And he actually had some insightful information, despite wearing a football helmet because people wanted to throw things at him. But basically said that, it was common things that irritate consumers: calling too early, calling too late, calling outside of the calling times, repetitive calling. And so if you look at like things of that nature, or things that, a lot of people are using more, I wouldn't say emerging or cutting edge because they've been around a little while, but there's things that people don't understand as consumers, like ringless voicemail or avatars, right? So as soon as you bring those into the mix, where you're not delivering a good customer experience, that can drive people to go, hey, you know what, this company here is aggravating me. And it's not just the apps and things where people can file things on their own. There's companies that advertise, like you look at like Morgan & Morgan down in Florida, for the people is their motto. Well, if you go around and if you ever spend any time in Florida, chances are you've seen their billboards or seen their TV ads, which they advertise, hey, getting unwanted calls or texts, owe money that somebody's harassing you. You want to collect $1,500? Call us. We'll help you recover that. So I think, you got to be mindful of that, when you're looking at how many times do you call a lead. I think you really got to limit some of that. And, if they're not answering your call, it could be the other issue, which is plaguing a bunch of the lead calls, which is the scam likely call blocking issue, where it's simply because your caller ID number has basically been tagged by the carriers, wrongly or rightly, as a telemarketer where they're trying to limit robocalls. There's a good chance they're not answering your call because they're seeing scam likely or fraud. And as soon as the consumer sees that, typically they won't answer it. On the call blocking side, you won't even see that happen. So that's really the bigger issue that could.
You guys have a product though that can score a number. Is that correct?
Yeah, we've been able to get access to the analytic companies that are feeding this data into the carriers. So we have the ability to basically score caller ID numbers on a high, medium, low basis, so that when your numbers are starting a campaign, you can make sure that they're not running hot. But more importantly, as your lead gen campaign starts to get momentum, we can tell you when those numbers go medium or hot, so you can figure out how to address the issue, either from a behavioral standpoint of reaching out or from the standpoint of having other phone numbers that you can use to replace them. Because what I'm hearing on the lead gen side is that a customer will say, look, I've got this campaign, I've got brand new numbers, I've only made limited phone calls, and I'm already getting flagged on the second or third phone call. And it really boils down to the fact that there's analytics, the analytics firms that are powering the stuff with the carriers are using real simplistic information that basically looks at irregular traffic, abnormal traffic. And if you look at lead gen, it's not always consistent. It's based on when the lead comes in. So they say, oh, okay, this phone number is hardly used. All of a sudden it's got a spike in traffic. Must be a robocall. Let's label this one. And then you get consumers that are using these call screening apps like Mr. Number, No More Robo, RoboKiller, etc. They get the calls, it gets past the call screening, and they have the ability to crowdsource the data and flag it on their end. So it's a combination of both of those things that are driving that score up. So if you aren't monitoring it, you're not checking the health scores, there's a good chance that you're going to run into the problem where you're going to get 20, 30% of your records or more. And in the case of blocked records, you're basically making a call that's never even going through.
So I wanted to just and I'm Rich, I've got a question teed up for you, but I want to just make sure that when these questions are being answered, especially how Ryan has answered these, a lot of the answers don't just fall under the TCPA. They may fall under TSR. They may fall under very specific state guidelines for the time. We have a lot of COVID-related telemarketing laws that are out there. And so it's important, one, to be hooked up with somebody that can give you the most up-to-date information, i.e. the council. I mean, you can always look at our Twitter feed and any of the other types of things that we're putting out, these webinars, and get that information. But also on dnc.com, they have an incredible monthly update on what's going on out there as it relates to seasonal and monthly telemarketing restrictions that might have to do with anything. It's very strange from state to state. So I just want to make sure that a lot of times when we're talking about things, it doesn't necessarily have to be TCPA that govern your call center or your outbound or inbound marketing efforts as it relates to calls. Rich, I want to get into something that's a little touchy. We touched on it a little bit earlier, but you said, okay, if there's a company that has either known fraud or has fraud that they don't know about, right? And it's difficult. So if you're selling a bunch of leads and somebody's buying a bunch of those leads, and some guy from some company called Anura, that means frogs or something, comes along and says, hey, look, I think you got fraud. I think you're going to find that there's fraud in there, and it could be as high as 20%. If I'm selling people and they're measuring me on the performance of the leads that I'm selling, and you're just telling me that you're going to introduce something that's going to cut 20% of that volume out, dude, do I really want to talk to you or deal with you? What do you got for me if I'm in that case, man? If I'm sitting in that seat, what do you tell me?
Well, at the end of the day, the only thing I can show is that across the board, all our clients since taking on our software have reduced fraud and grown their companies because the quality of that they're delivering, the ROI that they're delivering to their clients are higher. Because like I said, if you eliminate fraud, you increase ROI on the campaigns, clients increase their demand, you grow as a company. And we've seen this time and time again with every one of our clients. However, you every once in a while get that where, especially some of the bigger companies, the publicly traded companies, are you going to knock out 20-25% of my fraud immediately?
Not
like,
possible.
No.
Right.
What we're going to do is we're going to identify where the fraud's coming from. And we come up with a game plan for them because, let's say, at the end of the day, they're here with the fraud. They want to get down. They want to get the fraud out of there without killing their company in the process. So the process is very simple. Let's identify the egregious places of where frauds come, start eliminating those little by little, and at the same token, let's focus on where the good stuff is coming from and start incentivizing or getting more traffic from those sources. I had an example of a publicly traded company that had 24% fraud. Same thing. You're going to kill my company. I said, no, this is how we're going to do it. We came up with a 3-month game plan to cut it in half. So we're going to go from 24% down to about 12% fraud in the next 3 months. And we're going to work with you to make sure you understand what's going on and who you got to deal with. And what we did was we were able to increase our overall traffic volume by 5%, reduce fraud to under 11% inside of 5 weeks. Then we said, okay, we hit the goal. Let's do it again. Let's cut it in half again. And you keep doing that until you get to a point where you're like, you know what? I got 3% fraud. I can flip the switch and not worry about it anymore. Then they go real time. They block the 3% that's left, and they just keep focusing on driving in more traffic like they would normally. And that's how, and what's happening is that all along that process, in fact, with this particular company, they had a client that popped up and said, once they broke it in half, they got half the traffic. They go, whatever you're doing is working great. Our ROI is through the roof. We want more traffic. And that locks in and solidifies the concept with the client when they actually see the result happen. So it's part of the game. It's understanding, like, when you start getting clients complaining, then it's an easy conversation because I'm getting the phone call and we do the check. I know I'm going to see 20, 25, 30% fraud or more. And it's a very easy process. It's the clients that have 5 to 10% fraud, even less than 5% fraud. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Is kind of the mentality a lot of them have. And I get that. But at the end of the day, it depends on what type of company you want to run. Do you want to get away with what little fraud that's there just because no one's complaining about it? Or do you want to step up and be more proactive and eliminate it so that you can give the highest possible quality to your clients?
Yeah, I remember we were on the stage with Eric Troutman and TCPA attorney, defense attorney with TCPAworld.com. And we asked him, like, what is the biggest threat to the industry? And obviously I would expect a TCPA answer come back. I think, Rich, you were in that audience in Orlando when I asked the question. And he was very clear about the biggest threat from a TCPA perspective to the industry. And he said it was ad fraud. It was fraud. It was the fraudulent fill of a form with the inaccurate information that immediately creates a TCPA violation. And he was very clear about making that comment, and it could be, if not the biggest threat to the industry right now, if something's not done. And we do know that the FTC, with Andrew Smith in charge of the Consumer Protection Bureau under the FTC, he's made it very clear that the responsibility to protect the consumer is on all shoulders, the lead generator, the lead buyer, everybody that makes the call. And so I can only assume that at some point the attention, especially in court, we're seeing it because we know that if the information, and the Ninth Circuit said it last week, if the information isn't correct, it's a TCPA violation. So we do know that the courts are already finding this. So I would believe it's only a matter of time before we start seeing the organizations like the FTC and the FCC attacking fraud as a primary enemy in all of this TCPA and consumer protection. Ryan, you being on the TCPA, worried about, outcomes of court cases and things like that. One of the questions was that, I'd like to see what your answer was. If I put my wife's information in the form because this phone right now is in my wife's name and you guys call me, is that a TCPA violation?
Well, it really depends on the
if I sue
intention,
you,
right? Yeah, depends who you are.
No violation if there's no lawsuit, right?
I mean, look, the litigators know the game, that they know that a good TCPA attorney is going to be a lot per the hour. I just talked to a client this morning and they're like, yeah, we know if we get sued and we have to go engage with counsel, that's 20, 25 grand just to figure out what's going on. So that's why you see a lot of these cases that, where, it's all really about assessing that threat level of that complaint. If somebody does, come in and say, hey, look, you called me, you texted me, I didn't consent to you, or they play the opt-out game where, especially with SMS, you don't know who you're talking to because it's, you don't have an agent behind it. They'll, put in a stop request with an S with a special character, and they'll truncate it on the filing, and then they'll say, look, we opted out. You guys kept texting us. Going down that path to assess the threat level is really important. So we have, for a lot of our enterprise clients, developed a way where they can go search these litigators not only by phone number, but also by name. And they can look at the dockets and find out, like, are we dealing with an Andrew Perong or Melody Stoops or Bonte Reuter or Terry Fabricant, who we would classify him as a tier 1. Absolutely, you want to engage counsel at that point because they've done it before and they show up in the lead gen channel for a reason. But if you've got somebody who they just went in over to robocalls.cash, they just downloaded a form kit, and maybe this is their first rodeo, you might be able to get away with pushing back on those and kind of handling them yourselves. But kind of looking at what level of complaint you have, how serious it is, but also using that kind of canary in the coal mine effect that you might have a bigger problem upstream with your lead providers of someone who's, they've given you the standard MO of, well, we got consent on all these and they're all certified. That may not be true, and they may be, farming these leads out without getting that one-to-one consent, because that's the other bigger problem in lead gen. Just because somebody went on and looking for an educational opportunity doesn't mean you can sell it to every for-profit school in America. It's got to be very linear, and it's all based on customer expectation. If they weren't expecting the call, the law is kind of on their side. And with the liability issue out there, they can sue your company, they can sue you personally, they can sue principals of companies. So there's a lot of risk out there that, they aim to shake things up because at the end of the day, they're looking for a payoff. So
what I'm hearing, and we've only got a couple of minutes, and I want to make sure that I get some contact information. But what I'm hearing, and knew to be true, this world is filled with a bunch of risk. It's best to try to mitigate that risk with partners who can help mitigate that risk. It starts with getting an attorney to help write those disclosures and look at the things that you're advertising, and you're not deceptive, you're not deceiving the consumer. It flows down to making sure that you have third-party lead verification, i.e., once again, Jornaya or Active Prospect in the mix. That's going to help when you're ultimately sued, when you're making calls in an area of TCPA compliance. We have at the top of the funnel, at the form fill, we have all of those things in place and still have risk as it relates to ad fraud and fraudulent activity at the form level. And so we have Anura there to help us out, and then ultimately to help identify known litigators and look at scoring our phone numbers for scam likely, and all of the other tools that are going to help mitigate that risk. They're represented here today. So guys, look, I can't thank you guys enough for sitting here and sharing your hour with our audience. We're going to get this thing recorded or published here soon, probably tomorrow, so that everybody can look at it again. Rich, how can we get a hold of you?
You can get us at Anura.io, rich@Anura.io, or 888-337-0641.
By the way, Beth said, happy wife, happy life. Put that into my question. So when you're doing marriage fraud, just remember that, Rich Kahn.
We've been together 32 years, so I guess I'm doing a good job.
Awesome. I love that. Ryan, look, how can they get a hold of you guys over at dnc.com?
You can reach out to me directly, ryan@dnc.com, or my phone number is 707-480-5920. Like I said, Rob, we've got a lot of good guides on there for people that are trying to figure out what part of the TCPA applies to them. How do I get good consent? We've also got the ability in-house to do consulting around TCPA. So if you want us to review your language that's on your sites, make sure that you're getting the proper consent that will hold up in court, or make sure that you're getting that third-party dialer review, reviewing your vendors, all that other fun stuff. We can also help outside of that. But I think to your point, it's all about having good technology stacks that are out there, right? So a lot of my clients, they start with Anura. They make sure that the fraud's getting weeded out. They kick that over to us. We take care of the litigators, the right party, the reassign, and then they'll check their caller IDs. Let's make sure that those phone numbers are good, because it's all about trying to maximize your performance. You only have a limited window to get a hold of these leads, and so the more you can do on the front end, because at the end of the day, if you paid for bad leads, you can have already paid for a lead that caused you a TCPA problem. So it's really I think helpful to kind of look at some of the technologies out there. And that's kind of what I've enjoyed about being part of the Leads Council and doing these events. And now we're all kind of doing them virtually, but hopefully we'll be back at some point doing summits and doing Leads Council events. But no, this has been a great conversation.
Awesome. Well, guys, thank you very much. And everybody that attended and showed up today, thank you very much. Head on over to leadscouncil.org. We have an events hub page. We also have a jobs hub page, which lists some of the open jobs in the industry. That events hub page is where you're going to be able to find the recording of this in a day or two. I will send it out also in our weekly newsletters that we do. I certainly appreciate this time, and we'll see you next Thursday, 3 p.m. Eastern. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.